thundering sound of helicopters once sent waves of fear through the skies of Burkina Faso. But in 2025, that familiar roar carried something entirely new: hope. Those same machines, once symbols of war and unrest, now rained life instead of death. From their bellies, they scattered 100 tons of golden corn seeds across the cracked, thirsty earth of the Sahel. For decades, this land had been defined by hunger, by its parched soil, its wandering winds, and the sight of entire villages packing up to flee the creeping march of the desert. But now something extraordinary was happening. What used to be a battlefield was turning into a field of dreams. When the helicopters passed, dust rose like smoke. Children watched from their huts as tiny specks, the seeds of life, fluttered down and vanished into the sand. And then, as the months passed, something miraculous emerged from that dry ground. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, waving like flags of defiance. Those who once wept for food now worked side by side, their hands sowing the future. The transformation had begun, and at its center stood a man whose name had become both a rallying cry and a mystery: Ibrahim Traoré. To the world, he was a military leader. But to his people, he had become something much deeper: a guardian of life, a man who had turned the weapons of war into the tools of rebirth. He didn't just speak about sovereignty, he planted it. Literally, Traoré had once stood in front of cameras, telling the world that Burkina Faso would no longer be a slave to foreign aid or global powers. But no one expected what came next. Instead of announcing a new military campaign, he announced a farming revolution. The plan was bold: to plant 1 billion corn plants across the Sahel within 2 years. It sounded impossible. Experts called it madness. But the people believed him, because he didn't just talk about hope. He delivered it in sacks of seed, dropped from the very helicopters that once carried fear. By the summer of 2025, fields that had once cracked under the sun now shimmered with waves of green. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the rustling of corn leaves in the wind. The same land that had buried the dreams of countless generations was now feeding them. Farmers who had given up returned home. Villages that had been ghost towns came back to life. Children who had known only hunger began to chase butterflies through the tall grass of cornfields. And in the heart of the country, under a flag that once fluttered over battlefields, stood Ibrahim, quiet, calm, and watchful. He knew the battle wasn't over. But this time it wasn't against men or empires. It was against the soil itself, against the centuries of despair written into the land. The initiative was called Operation Golden Seed. It was more than an agricultural project. It was a symbol of self-reliance. Traoré believed that true independence didn't come from speeches or military power. It came from feeding your people with your own hands. The real revolution, he said in one of his rare interviews, is when the farmer becomes more powerful than the soldier. As cornfields stretched further every day, international observers grew skeptical. Some accused him of propaganda, calling the operation a staged performance. But reporters who dared to visit saw something undeniable. The people were working, and the land was changing. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the world's poorest nations, was now exporting hope. Satellite images showed patches of green expanding through the desert, a pattern spreading across borders into Mali and Niger. Other African nations began to send delegations to study what had happened. The story of a man who turned weapons into wings of life was spreading across the continent. In one village, an old woman held up an ear of corn and said, "This is our freedom." In another, children painted murals of helicopters dropping seeds, their artwork bright with yellow and green. The symbol of war had been rewritten into the symbol of rebirth. But behind every success, there were nights of silence. Nights when Traoré stood on the edge of the fields, staring into the horizon, knowing that change came with enemies. Not everyone wanted to see Burkina Faso rise. Foreign corporations who once profited from selling seeds and grain began to lose their grip. The idea that Africa could feed itself threatened the foundation of their wealth. "They fear a fed Africa," one farmer said, "because a fed Africa does not bow." That was the heart of Traoré's dream. Not just corn, not just harvests, but dignity. He wanted the child of Burkina Faso to eat bread made from his own land, not one imported from across the sea. And slowly, that dream began to take shape, one seed at a time. The helicopters had stopped flying now. Their job was done. The rest was up to the rain, the soil, and the people. Across the plains, green waves shimmered under the golden sun, like an ocean of hope reclaiming the desert. Farmers walked barefoot between the rows, touching the leaves as though they were touching the future. Every plant told a story of courage, of pain, of belief. A story that said, even the driest soil can bloom when watered by will. And in the capital, Traoré watched it all unfold on screens. He didn't smile much, but those who saw him that day said his eyes shone with something rare: peace. For the first time in generations, the people of Burkina Faso didn't look to the sky in fear. They looked to it in gratitude. But revolutions, even the peaceful ones, rarely come without storms. As the fields grew taller, so did the whispers. Some foreign media began calling the movement Traoré's illusion, claiming the soil would never sustain large-scale farming. Others accused him of nationalizing resources, of shutting the doors to Western investors. Yet within Burkina Faso, none of that mattered. The people had seen the proof with their own eyes, green stretching where there had once been only dust. One morning, Traoré visited the northern provinces. His convoy passed through roads that had once been guarded by soldiers. Now those same paths were lined with farmers carrying baskets of maize. When he stepped out of his vehicle, the crowd surged forward, not to protest, not to plead, but to offer him the first harvest. An old man approached, his hands trembling as he held out an ear of corn. "This," he said, "is our new weapon." For a moment, the general said nothing. He simply nodded, took the corn, and looked out over the fields. The air was heavy with the scent of soil and sunlight. "This," he finally replied, "is what victory tastes like." But while his people celebrated, beyond the borders, unease spread. Trade companies from Europe and America began lobbying against Burkina Faso's new policies. They warned that the country was setting a dangerous precedent. For decades, Africa had been seen as a continent that needed, not one that led. Traoré was challenging that narrative, and that made him dangerous. Soon, economic sanctions began tightening. Aid programs were halted. News outlets painted him as a dictator hiding behind the mask of reform. But inside the country, markets buzzed with new life. Local production was climbing, and young people who had once dreamed of escaping to Europe were now starting businesses at home. One group of students launched a startup that converted corn husks into biodegradable packaging. Another built machines from scrap metal to process maize flour. The government funded community mills, ensuring that every region could grind its own grain. Burkina Faso was becoming self-sufficient, and with every harvest, the people's confidence grew. Still, Traoré knew that prosperity was fragile. He spent nights in meetings with agronomists and soldiers alike, discussing irrigation, storage, and seed protection. "If they cannot conquer us with weapons," he said once, "they will try with hunger again. We must make hunger impossible." That line spread like wildfire. It was painted on school walls, printed on posters, and sung in the streets by children. Make hunger impossible. It became the new national anthem in spirit, even if not in song. By 2026, Burkina Faso's transformation had reached a turning point. The country was exporting surplus maize to its neighbors. Drought-prone regions saw community wells and irrigation canals built by volunteers. Even the desert seemed to hesitate at the borders of this new green empire. Foreign analysts called it the Sahel miracle. But Traoré refused to take the credit. "I am only a gardener," he told a journalist. "It is the people who planted hope." Behind that humility, though, was a man constantly under threat. There were rumors of assassination attempts, of internal power struggles. Yet through it all, he remained calm. He continued visiting villages, often without escort, shaking hands with farmers, sharing meals of corn porridge and roasted maize under the open sky. His leadership style was unlike anything the region had seen. Neither soft nor boastful, but deeply grounded in purpose. The seeds had changed not just the soil, but the spirit of the nation. Songs were written about them. School children drew pictures of helicopters raining gold. In markets, women sold corn with pride, calling it grain of freedom. Then came a season of drought. The skies closed for months, and the rivers shrank. Fields cracked once again. The people worried that all their work might be undone. But this time, they did not wait for aid trucks. They had learned to adapt, digging trenches, collecting rainwater, and protecting their crops with makeshift irrigation systems. They fought back, not with weapons, but with wisdom. When the rains finally returned, the entire nation rejoiced. Bells rang, drums echoed, and children danced barefoot in the mud. Traoré watched from the steps of his office as the people celebrated their own endurance. "This," he whispered to his aides, "is the real Independence Day." The revolution had gone far beyond farming. It had become a new philosophy, one that said Africa's wealth did not lie in gold or oil, but in the hands of its people and the soil beneath their feet. And so, from Burkina Faso, the message spread. Leaders from neighboring nations began visiting to learn from the model. Some mocked it at first, until they saw the overflowing granaries and the thriving villages. Then slowly they began to copy it. Helicopters began dropping seeds in Mali. In Niger, local militias disbanded to join community farms. Across the Sahel, the sound of blades and bullets faded, replaced by the rhythm of hoes striking soil. The desert was retreating. The people were returning. The continent was awakening. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Traoré stood alone on a hill overlooking miles of golden fields. The horizon blazed like fire, and the wind carried the sound of laughter from distant villages. He thought of the generations before him, of men who had fought wars they did not start, of women who had prayed for rain that never came, of children who had died waiting for bread. He closed his eyes and said quietly, "We have finally broken the curse." A journalist once asked him, "What will history remember you for?" He smiled faintly and replied, "If they remember me at all, let it be as the man who planted something that outlived him." In the end, that's exactly what he did. Because in the heart of Burkina Faso, the corn still grows, green, tall, and proud. It sways gently under the same sun that once burned the land dry. And every stalk whispers the same story, that hope once planted can never truly die.